Marco Contini was heading home from a closed-door business meeting when the clock in his car read 17 minutes past 2. His convoy turned off the highway onto the old Poplar Road, a stretch of asphalt that belonged more to delivery trucks in daylight than to anyone after midnight. Rain had been coming down for close to an hour, gentle at first, then thick enough to smear the windshield and turn the pavement into a sheet of black glass under the headlights. Marco sat in the back of the lead car, still dressed in the dark suit he had worn to the meeting. The negotiations had dragged late. Papers signed, hands shaken, men who liked to appear important dropping their voices whenever he looked their way. He was worn down, though not drowsy. Men in his position rarely gave themselves permission to sleep easily. Beyond the glass, the Poplar Road ran between abandoned warehouses and empty fields, its broken lamps casting thin, uneven circles onto the wet ground. No shops were lit, no houses stood nearby, no one walked in that rain. There was only the hiss of tires cutting through standing water and the occasional white flash of lightning behind the clouds. Then the driver braked hard enough to jolt Marco forward and pull his eyes up. The second car braked as well, its headlights sweeping sideways across the storm. "What is it?" Marco asked. The driver didn't answer right away. He was frozen, staring ahead. In the middle of the road, straddling the faded center line, something pale blue lay soaked in the rain. At a glance, it might have passed for a discarded blanket, a small sodden heap dropped exactly where any vehicle would be forced to stop or swerve. One of Marco's men leaned forward, hand drifting toward his jacket. "Stay in the car, boss. Could be a setup." Marco kept his eyes on the shape without blinking. In his world, anything left in the center of a deserted road at 2 a.m. could be a trap, bait, a warning, or the opening move of something designed to draw him out into the open. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Then the blue fabric twitched, barely. Just a small, weak shift beneath the downpour. Marco pushed his door open. "Check both sides of the road," he said. "Watch the warehouses." "Boss, wait." He didn't wait. The rain soaked through his shoulders the instant he stepped out. 2 of his men fanned out ahead, weapons low, scanning the road, the dead street lamps, the warehouse entrances, and the tree line past the shoulder. Marco walked toward the bundle himself. It sat directly in his car's path. Whoever left it hadn't bothered to hide it. They had wanted it found, wanted someone to stop. Maybe they hoped the child would be discovered. Maybe they simply wanted her gone without a name attached. Marco crouched and peeled back the soaked cloth. Inside lay a newborn girl, tiny, drenched, trembling from the cold. Her face was flushed red, her eyes shut tight, her fists curled against her chest. She let out a small, thin cry. Not loud enough to carry far, but enough to tell him she was breathing. For a moment, he didn't move. There was no note tucked beside her, no name, no hospital bracelet, nothing to say where she'd come from or who had left her. One of his guards edged closer and murmured, "She's just a baby." Marco slid one hand under her head and the other beneath the wet cloth, lifted her against his chest, and pulled his coat over her to block the rain. She weighed almost nothing, yet even the blanket seemed heavy on her. Her skin was far too cold. "Bring the car around," he said, and the driver reversed toward him at once. Marco climbed into the back seat with the infant tucked inside his coat. "Drive," he ordered. "Straight to the house." The car was already moving before the door had fully shut. He looked down at her breathing shallow, her small fingers uncurling to press against his shirt, searching for warmth. She had no idea who he was, no idea what his name meant to people, or how much fear it carried. She only knew he was warm. He drew her in a little closer, careful not to press too hard, and pulled out his phone. "Get Dr. Farina on the line," he told the man up front. "Tell him to meet me at the house immediately." "Yes, sir. Call a pediatrician too, and whoever's on call for newborns at Santa Lucia. Whoever can get there fastest, tell them I found a child in the rain and I want her examined from head to toe." The guard began dialing. Marco kept his eyes on the baby. "I want oxygen ready, warm blankets, medication, whatever they need to find out if she's hurt or sick or fading." "Yes, sir. And call the house. Tell Teresa to have the warmest room ready before we arrive." The infant whimpered again and turned her face into the fabric of his coat. He lowered his voice, not because he thought she could understand him, but because she was too fragile for anything harsher. "You're done with that road," he murmured. No one else in the car spoke. Behind them, the Poplar Road vanished into the storm. Inside, Marco held the child and tracked every breath she drew. A few minutes later, the guard turned from the front seat. Dr. Farina's on his way. The pediatrician, too. The newborn specialist asked how far out we are. Tell him 10 minutes, Marco said. The guard nodded and went back to the phone. Marco looked down again. He had witnessed cruelty before, caused plenty of it himself, but this felt different. This wasn't two men fighting over territory. It wasn't a debt, a betrayal, an act of revenge. This was a newborn left on a road for strangers to decide whether she lived. By the time the convoy reached the Contini estate, every light at the front of the house was already burning. Staff waited near the entrance with towels and warm blankets. Marco stepped out with the baby still cradled against him and walked straight inside without a word. No one asked questions. They had worked for him long enough to know when silence was the safer choice. Dr. Farina arrived minutes later, rain still beaded on his glasses, medical bag in hand. A pediatrician followed, then a newborn specialist summoned from Santa Lucia, both pulled from sleep and rushing through the storm because Marco Contini had said the child couldn't wait. They set up a table in the warmest room in the house. Marco laid the baby down, but didn't step back. Check everything, he said. Her breathing, her temperature, her heartbeat, her bones. I want to know if anyone heard her before they left her there. The doctors moved fast, peeling off the wet cloth, wrapping her in warm linen, checking her pulse, listening to her lungs, wiping away the rainwater, searching her skin for bruises. Marco stood beside the table, still in his soaked coat. He didn't sit. He didn't look away. After several long minutes, Dr. Farina straightened. She's very weak, too cold, dehydrated. She needs care right away, but she's alive. Marco let out a slow breath. Was she hurt? No broken bones, no clear signs of trauma. The doctor hesitated, exchanging a glance with the pediatrician. Marco caught it. What is it? The pediatrician leaned in and made a soft sound near the infant's ear. Nothing. He tried the other side. Still nothing. Then he asked a nurse to drop a small metal instrument into a tray beside the table. The clatter made everyone in the room glance up. The baby didn't flinch. Marco's expression shifted. What are you checking for? The doctor chose his words carefully. She isn't reacting to sound the way a newborn typically would. We'll need proper testing to be certain, but it's possible. Marco waited. She may be deaf. The room went still. Marco looked at the infant lying under the warm light. Only a short while ago, she had been abandoned in the middle of an empty road. No name, no proof anyone had ever wanted her. The reason behind it all began to feel painfully obvious. So that's why they left her, he said. No one answered. The baby's small hand slipped free of the blanket, and when Marco pressed a finger near her palm, she gripped it weakly. He studied her for a long moment. They heard one word from a doctor, he said quietly, and decided her whole life was already over. Dr. Farina lowered his eyes. The newborn specialist offered, "Some families panic at news like this. They assume the child won't live a normal life, that she'll never speak, that she'll be a burden." Marco looked at him. "She isn't a burden." "No, sir." He turned back to the child, her fingers still curled around his, barely covering it. "If someone left her because she couldn't hear them," he said, "then she'll stay with someone who learns to understand her." No one argued. His decision was already made. "Get her whatever she needs," he continued. "The best specialists, every test that's necessary. Cost isn't a factor." Dr. Farina nodded. "Of course." "And if no one comes looking for her," Marco added, glancing at the baby again, "she stays here." One of the men near the door looked up, startled. "Sir?" Marco didn't raise his voice. "She stays here." The doctor hesitated. "There are legal steps, child services, paperwork, an investigation." "Then handle it," Marco said. "But no one hands her off to some cold system tonight. She doesn't become a file on somebody's desk. Not tonight." He brushed his thumb gently over her hand. "As of tonight, she's my daughter." The room stayed silent for several seconds. Outside, the rain kept tapping against the windows. Inside, the baby slept beneath the warm light, unaware that the first person to truly choose her was a man the world had never expected to be gentle. The days that followed reshaped the Contini estate in ways no one there fully grasped at first. The house had always been quiet, but never peaceful. Men drifting in and out with sealed folders, phones ringing at strange hours, guards standing like statues in the corridors. every room polished, costly, and cold. Then the baby arrived, and the cold house began making space for small, soft things. Warm bottles, tiny socks, a white cradle set up near Marco's private sitting room because he refused to let her sleep too far from him. Doctors visited daily. Nurses stayed through the nights. Specialists tested her hearing more thoroughly and confirmed what the first doctor had suspected: profound hearing loss. She would never experience sound the way other children did. She might never speak in the conventional sense. But she was alive, and to Marco that was the only fact that mattered. Child services got involved, forms were filed, hospitals were questioned, missing birth records were traced. No one came forward. No mother appeared, no father, no family name attached itself to her, as though she had been born from the storm itself and set down in front of Marco's car for reasons no one could explain. He didn't hunt for whoever had abandoned her, not right away, though everyone in the city knew he could trace a debtor from a single footprint if he chose to. But he didn't want her earliest days under his roof shaped by revenge. He wanted them shaped by warmth. Before she learned anything else in this world, he wanted her to learn that someone had stayed. On the 7th night, the baby lay wrapped in a fresh white blanket in what had once been a guest room, now faintly smelling of lotion and warm milk. Marco stood by the cradle, while Teresa, the longtime housekeeper, watched from the doorway. "She needs a name," Teresa said softly. Marco looked down at the child. Her eyes were open now, dark and steady, fixed on his face, as though she recognized him by shape rather than by voice. "Stella," he said. Teresa's expression eased. "I found her in the dark," he explained. "She should have something bright." He reached down and let the baby's fingers close around his thumb. "Stella Contini." Teresa crossed herself quietly, not out of fear of the name, but because she understood its weight. The child was no longer a guest, no longer a rescued stranger. She was a Contini. From that night on, Marco started learning a language he had never imagined he'd need. The first word he mastered wasn't power, wasn't territory, wasn't retribution. It was milk, then sleep, then safe. Then Papa. He sat at his desk late into the night with business documents shoved to one side and sign language manuals open in front of him. His hands, accustomed to issuing orders with a single small gesture, fumbling over the gentler shapes meant for a baby who couldn't hear his voice. At first, the staff whispered when they caught him practicing. They stopped whispering the first time Stella smiled at him after he signed safe. No one had the heart to laugh after that. Months went by. Stella grew. She learned faces before sounds, expressions before words, touch before voice. She recognized Marco by the way he entered a room, by the shadow of him near her cradle, by the warmth of his palm against her back. She learned his face went calm whenever he looked at her, that his hands were always careful, that if she cried without a sound, he still came. Marco changed too, though no one said so out loud. Meetings ended earlier. Men who arrived at the estate with hard voices lowered them the moment they noticed the small girl sleeping near the office. Guards who had once carried only weapons started carrying stuffed animals, picture books, and pink hair clips because Stella had pointed at them once and smiled. The house that had always felt like stone slowly learned to breathe around her. When Stella turned 2, she began signing back. Her first clear sign wasn't milk or sleep. It was Papa. Marco was standing near the window, talking to one of his men, when Teresa gasped from across the room. He turned to find Stella sitting on the carpet, staring straight at him, one small hand touching her chin, before moving outward in the gesture she'd been practicing for days. "Papa!" Marco lost track of whatever his man had been saying. He crossed the room slowly and knelt in front of her. She smiled, proud of herself, and signed it again. "Papa." He didn't cry. Men like him weren't raised to cry in front of others, but he closed his hand around hers and stayed on that carpet a long while the man by the door quietly looked away. By the time Stella turned 5, the city had settled on 2 truths about Marco Contini. The first was that he remained dangerous to anyone foolish enough to cross him. The second was that his daughter was the center of his entire world. Stella had soft, dark hair, bright eyes, and a way of watching people that made them feel seen even though she couldn't hear them. She didn't speak in the way most people expected, but her hands were never short of words. She signed for water, for tiredness, for anger, joy, fear, pride, curiosity. Marco understood almost all of it, and if he missed something, she would roll her eyes in a way that made Teresa laugh before repeating the sign more slowly, like a patient teacher correcting a slow student. He never treated her silence as emptiness. He treated it as a language the rest of the world was simply too lazy to learn. He brought her to doctors, specialists, private tutors, but never anywhere that made her feel like a problem to be solved. Still, the world outside had ways of wounding children without ever laying a hand on them. One afternoon, Marco brought Stella to a private charity function at a hotel, supposed to be safe, quiet, contained. She wore a pale blue dress and held his hand as they crossed a room full of polished guests, pretending not to stare. Near the dessert table, two women watched Stella sign to her father and dropped their voices just low enough to be cruel. "Poor thing," one of them murmured. "Beautiful child, but damaged." Stella couldn't hear the word, but she saw the woman's face. She saw the pity. Children read expressions long before adults remember to hide them. She looked up at Marco and signed. "Damaged means what?" His chest tightened. He looked over at the women. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. "Damaged," he said quietly, "is when a person can look at a child and still choose cruelty." The women went pale. Stella watched his face, then looked down at her own hands. That night she was quieter than usual. She sat in his office with a doll in her lap, not playing, not drawing, just staring at the carpet. Marco finished a call and came to sit on the floor in front of her. He signed sad. She nodded. Then she signed broken. Something inside him twisted. He signed back, slowly, deliberately, not broken. Stella looked at him, her fingers trembling slightly. "Then why leave me?" He had answered men in courtrooms, faced down enemies in warehouses, argued with businessmen surrounded by lawyers, but no question had ever been harder than the one his daughter had just asked with her small hands. He took a breath and signed carefully. "Because they didn't understand you. And some people are afraid of what they don't understand." Her eyes filled with tears, silent and heavy. He reached out and touched her cheek. "But I understand you." She shook her head once and signed, "You learned." He nodded. "Yes, I learned." She studied him a long moment, then touched his face with both hands, as if to confirm he was real, and slowly signed 3 words he had taught her but never asked her to use. "I love you, Papa." Marco went completely still. He had heard men swear loyalty, heard enemies beg, heard people dress up lies in beautiful words, but nothing in his life had ever reached him the way those small, silent hands did. He pulled her into his arms and held her close. She rested her head against his chest, feeling his heartbeat, because that was how she knew when he was crying, even without a sound. After that night, he grew even more protective of her. He didn't want her hidden from the world, but he despised the way the world sometimes looked at her. Teresa told him a child needed more than protection. She needed warmth from more than one person, a woman in the house who could offer things he couldn't. He listened, though he wouldn't admit it. That was how Camilla Ferraro entered their lives. Camilla was beautiful, educated, polished in the way powerful families favored. She came from money and knew precisely when to smile, when to lower her eyes, when to say the right thing. In public, she acted warmly toward Stella, expensive dolls, air kisses near her cheek, comments to Marco about how lucky he was to have such a special daughter. He wanted to believe her, not for his own sake. He'd stopped needing anyone long ago, but for Stella's. He wanted to believe a woman could exist who would love her gently. Stella never trusted Camilla. She stiffened whenever Camilla touched her shoulder, stayed close to Marco during visits. When Camilla attempted to sign, she did it clumsily and laughed as though Stella's language were some kind of game. Marco noticed, but told himself trust simply took time. Camilla always smiled when he was in the room. She always sounded kind. Maybe Stella was shy, he told himself. Maybe he was being too cautious, letting fear cloud his judgment. Then, on an ordinary Thursday, a meeting was canceled without warning, and Marco came home early. Instead of heading to his office, he went looking for Stella. The house was quiet, too quiet. He reached the hallway outside her room and stopped at the sight of the half-open door. Inside, Camilla stood near the small writing desk. Stella was pressed against the bed, eyes wide, hands moving frantically, signing please and papa over and over. Camilla had her wrists gripped, not hard enough to leave a visible mark, but hard enough to stop her hands from moving. "Stop doing that," Camilla hissed. No one wants to watch you flap your hands around like some broken little thing. Stella froze, her mouth opening with no sound behind it. Camilla leaned in closer. Your father is going to marry me soon. Then this house won't revolve around you anymore. Understand? You'll learn to behave, or I'll make sure he sends you somewhere they know how to deal with children like you. Stella shook her head, tears streaking her face. Camilla picked up one of Stella's drawings from the desk. 3 figures, Marco, Stella, and Camilla, the last one drawn in a yellow dress because Marco had once said yellow looked kind. Camilla studied it and smiled without any warmth in it. You really think this is a family? She whispered, and tore the page in half. Marco stepped into the doorway. Take your hands off my daughter. Camilla spun so fast the torn drawing slipped from her fingers. Marco? Her expression flipped instantly, the coldness replaced by panic and sweetness. I was only teaching her some discipline. She was being difficult. He walked into the room without looking at her first. His eyes went straight to Stella. The child ran to him and wrapped herself around his leg, shaking. He bent and lifted her into his arms. She clung to his neck, her small hand signing frantically against his shoulder. Papa, sorry. He held her tighter and signed back so she could see. No, not sorry. Camilla's voice wavered. You're misunderstanding. She needs structure. She needs someone who won't let her use her condition to control everything. Marco finally turned to her. Her condition? Camilla swallowed. I didn't mean it that way. Yes, he said quietly. You did. She took a step toward him. Marco, please. I love you. I wanted to be a good wife to you. A good wife to me, he said. Wouldn't make my daughter afraid to use the only voice she has. Tears filled Camilla's eyes, though he could no longer tell if they were real. I made a mistake. No, he said. You showed me the truth. He looked down at the torn drawing on the floor, then at Stella's trembling hands. A woman who silences my daughter will never stand beside me. Camilla's face drained of color. You're ending our engagement over this? His answer came without hesitation. There's no engagement. You can't be serious. He shifted Stella higher against his chest, his voice low, level, and final. Leave this house. Camilla glanced at the guards in the hallway, then back at him, and for a moment fury broke through the composure she'd worn so carefully. You'll regret choosing a broken child over a real woman. The room fell silent. Something changed in Marco's eyes. Camilla seemed to realize, a beat too late, that she'd just said the one thing she could never unsay. Get out, Marco said, and this time no one waited. Teresa came in and gathered the torn drawing off the floor, while the guards escorted Camilla from the house. Marco sat on Stella's bed with her in his arms until the shaking eased. She touched his face, her eyes still wet, and signed, Camilla angry because Stella bad? He shook his head. No. She looked toward the door. Camilla hates Stella. He didn't want to lie to her, didn't want to teach her that cruelty was just confusion, or that hatred could wear the mask of love. So he signed the truth gently. Camilla doesn't know how to love you. Stella looked down. He tilted her chin up with one finger. That's her fault. Not yours. She watched his hands, then slowly signed, Papa, stay. He signed back without hesitation. Always. She curled into his chest and closed her eyes. He held her and stared at the doorway where Camilla had vanished. He had once believed the rain was the worst place Stella had ever been left. Now he understood there were other kinds of cold. Some people never left children on roadsides. They simply stood in warm rooms and still made them feel unwanted. That night he sat beside Stella until she fell asleep, one hand resting near hers so she'd wake knowing he hadn't left. Outside her door, Teresa waited. She'll heal, Teresa said softly. He looked through the open doorway at his daughter. She should never have had to. Teresa didn't argue. No one in that house ever did. After Camilla, Marco changed again. Not louder, not crueler. Just closed off. He canceled every introduction his advisors arranged, refused every family that hinted their daughters would make suitable wives. When people insisted Stella needed a mother figure, he gave them a look that ended the conversation on the spot. He had seen what happened when he trusted the wrong kind of softness, and he wasn't willing to risk her heart again. She remained the entirety of his world. He drove her to lessons, practiced signs with her every night, learned to braid her hair badly and then a little better, sat through silent tea parties with dolls lined up like business partners, let her stick decorations on his phone, his folders, once even on the sleeve of his black coat before an important meeting. Men who feared him learned to check their chairs before sitting, since Stella liked hiding tiny toy animals throughout the estate. Life carried on, but Marco kept the doors around his daughter's heart bolted tighter than ever. He had rescued her once from the rain, then again from Camilla. He promised himself no woman would come near her again unless she proved, without being asked, that Stella wasn't something to merely tolerate. She was someone to love, and he no longer believed such a woman existed. Months passed after Camilla left, but the damage lingered longer than anyone expected. Stella smiled again, played again, signed again, but sometimes her hands slowed whenever a new woman entered a room. Sometimes, before signing, she glanced at Marco first, as though asking permission to use her own voice. That hurt him more than anything Camilla had said. He never told Stella to be wary of people. He refused to let fear become her first lesson about the world. But he became wary for her, dismissing tutors who spoke over her head, declining invitations where people treated her like a charity story, watching every face that came near his daughter, not to control her life, but because he'd seen exactly what cruelty looked like when it wore perfume and smiled politely. Still, Teresa kept reminding him a child couldn't grow up inside walls forever. She needs the world too, she told him one afternoon while Stella sat on the floor drawing little moons across the backs of his business papers. A safe piece of it, at least. He looked at Stella, humming without sound, lips moving as she colored. The world hasn't been kind to her. Then show her the parts that can be, Teresa said. He didn't answer, but he heard her. 2 weeks later, he took Stella to La Perla, a quiet Italian restaurant near the old theater district. Not the loudest place in the city, not the most crowded, and since Marco owned half the building through one of his companies, security was simple. He chose a table near the back, away from the entrance but close enough that Stella could see the whole room. She wore a soft cream dress, her dark hair tied with a blue ribbon she'd picked herself, and held his hand as they walked in, her eyes drifting curiously across the chandeliers, the flower vases, the small candles on every table. He noticed everything she noticed. He always did. The staff grew visibly nervous the instant they recognized him. The manager rushed over, smiling too widely, promising the best table, the best wine, the best of everything. Marco cared about none of it. He watched only Stella. She looked up and signed, "Pretty lights." He signed back, "Yes, very pretty." She smiled, and for a few minutes he thought maybe Teresa had been right. Maybe this was good. Maybe Stella deserved small, ordinary pleasures like choosing dessert in a restaurant without people whispering nearby. Then the waiter arrived, young, well-dressed, hands trembling faintly around the menu. He looked at Marco, not at Stella. "What would she like, sir?" Marco's jaw tightened. Stella sat right there, menu open, one finger resting on a picture of strawberry cake. She looked at the waiter and signed, "Water, no ice." He blinked, confused, and looked back at Marco. "I'm sorry, sir. What would she like?" Camilla's voice surfaced in Marco's memory. "Stop doing that. No one wants to watch you wave your hands." Stella's hands slowly sank into her lap. That was when a waitress passing by with a tray stopped beside their table. She had warm brown eyes, dark hair pinned loosely at her neck, and a tiredness in her face that didn't read as weakness. It read as someone who had quietly survived something. Her name tag said Vera. She looked at Stella, not at Marco, and her expression shifted. Not pity, not discomfort, but recognition. She set the tray on a nearby stand, stepped closer, and lowered herself so Stella wouldn't have to look up too far. Then her hands moved. "Would you like water with ice or without?" Stella froze, eyes widening, staring at Vera's hands and then her face, as if she didn't quite trust what she'd just seen. Slowly, she signed, "You understand me." Vera smiled and signed back, perfectly. For one breath, the whole table went still. Then Stella's face lit up in a way Marco hadn't seen in public for months. She sat up straighter and signed quickly, "No ice and strawberry cake, but Papa says dinner first." Vera's smile widened. "Papa's probably right, but strawberry cake is important too." Stella giggled without sound, covering her mouth with both hands. Marco stared at Vera. He had paid for doctors, specialists, private tutors, therapists. He had built his daughter a world where she could be understood. But this waitress had done, in seconds, something money had never bought from a stranger. She had seen Stella first, not the silence, not the disability, not the powerful father beside her. The waiter looked embarrassed. Vera, I can take the table. She didn't look away from Stella. She already told me what she wants. Then she finally turned to Marco. Sir, would you like me to take the full order? He studied her. You know sign language? Yes. Why? Her expression stayed calm, though something flickered briefly behind her eyes. Because silence doesn't mean a child has nothing to say. He didn't respond right away. Stella tugged gently at his sleeve and signed, She sees my words. He looked down at his daughter, then back at Vera. Then you'll serve our table. The manager hurried over, worried something had gone wrong, but Marco raised a hand before he could speak. She stays. Vera took their order, and, more than that, she asked Stella if the candlelight bothered her eyes, whether she preferred pasta shapes or smooth soup, told her the strawberry cake had curls of white chocolate on top, and signed secret when she admitted the kitchen sometimes saved the biggest slice for kind customers. Stella watched every movement of her hands with open wonder. When Vera walked off, she turned to Marco and signed, Can she come back? He signed, She works here. Stella signed again, Still come back. He glanced across the room to where Vera was refilling water glasses at another table. He didn't trust easily, not anymore, but he couldn't ignore what he'd just witnessed. She hadn't tried to impress him, hadn't trembled at his name. She had simply spoken to his daughter in the only language that made Stella feel fully present. After dinner, once Stella had eaten half her cake and saved the rest for the next day, Marco had one of his men take her to the car for a moment. She resisted until he signed, I'll only speak with Vera, then we go home. Stella looked at Vera and signed, Thank you for seeing my words. Vera's expression softened. She signed back, Your words are beautiful. Stella smiled all the way to the door. Once she was outside, Marco turned to Vera. How did you learn? She folded her hands over her apron. My old neighborhood had a center for deaf children. I volunteered there. That's not the whole answer. Her lips pressed together for a moment. No, it isn't. He waited. He was good at silence. She glanced toward the window, where Stella was visible through the glass, sitting in the car beside Teresa, still holding her cake box. I learned because once I lost someone before I ever got to hear what her voice would have been. His expression shifted. A child? She looked back at him. My daughter. They told me she died the night she was born. The words came out soft, but not casual. They carried years behind them. He didn't press further. Something in her face told him the wound wasn't open for strangers. Your husband? He asked carefully. She gave a small, joyless smile. Left before I could even begin to heal. Said he couldn't live in a house that reminded him of loss. Darkness passed through Marco's eyes. He left you after losing a child. Some men only want women who hand them perfect lives. She looked away, embarrassed by how much she'd revealed. I'm sorry. That's not something I usually tell customers. I'm not most customers. No, she said quietly. I noticed. He nearly smiled, though not quite. My daughter needs someone who understands her, not just as a teacher, as a person. Vera stiffened. Mr. Contini, I have a job. I can pay you more than this restaurant ever will. That's not what I meant. He respected that. He'd expected fear, or greed, or flattery, and she offered none of it. Then tell me what you meant. I meant I don't step into worlds I don't understand just because a powerful man holds the door open. He studied her a long moment, then nodded. Fair. She looked surprised. Fair? You can say no. Can I? Yes. He glanced toward the car. But Stella will ask about you tomorrow. And the day after. Her face softened despite herself. She's a sweet child. She's more than sweet. I know, Vera said. That's why I noticed her. He pulled a card from inside his coat and set it on the table. If you decide to come, call this number. Daytime, public room, Teresa present. You can leave whenever you choose. She looked at the card, then at him. You make it sound very safe. For you, it will be. And for Stella? His answer came without pause. Stella is the reason I'm asking. Vera didn't take the card immediately. Then she picked it up and held it as though it weighed far more than paper. 2 days passed before she called. Stella asked about her a dozen times in between. On the third afternoon, Vera arrived at the Contini estate in a simple gray coat, carrying a canvas bag filled with children's books, colored cards, and homemade picture signs. She hesitated at the gate when it opened, and Marco saw the doubt cross her face. He couldn't blame her. The estate didn't look like a place where soft things survived. Then Stella came running across the entrance hall, stopping just short of Vera to sign, "You came back." Vera's nerves vanished. She knelt and signed, "You asked me to." Stella looked at Marco with pure joy, then back at Vera. That first lesson stretched on, and by the end of it, Stella had learned 3 new emotion signs: frustrated, proud, lonely. Marco stood near the doorway, pretending to read something on his phone while watching every second. Vera never treated Stella like something fragile. She didn't overpraise her for small things. She corrected her gently, laughed with her, waited for her, challenged her. When Stella got a sign wrong, Vera didn't speak over her. She simply repeated it until it landed. It was the kind of patience Marco had tried to buy for years and rarely found. Over the following weeks, Vera became part of Stella's routine, arriving in the afternoons after her restaurant shift ended. Sometimes they worked at the kitchen table, sometimes in the garden, sometimes on the library floor with cards scattered around them, Stella cross-legged beside her. Vera taught her signs for emotions Marco had never known how to explain well: afraid, safe, angry, proud, embarrassed, brave, home. Stella absorbed them quickly, as if she'd been waiting all along for someone to hand her names for things she'd always felt. One evening, after Vera taught her the sign for lonely, Stella grew quiet. Vera noticed at once. "Lonely?" she signed. Stella nodded. Before Vera. Vera's eyes filled, though she smiled gently. "And now?" Stella looked toward the doorway where Marco stood, then signed, "Papa, Vera, less lonely." He turned away before they could see his face. He had heard countless things in his life meant to move him: apologies, promises, confessions. But nothing had ever undone him quite like his daughter saying she felt less alone because one woman had walked into their house. Vera carried her own quiet wounds, and Marco noticed them in small moments: the way she lingered too long near Stella's baby photos, looked away when Teresa folded outgrown clothes. Once, when Stella climbed into her lap with a picture book, Vera held her a little too carefully, like someone cradling a memory she hadn't been allowed to keep. Stella noticed too. She touched Vera's cheek one afternoon and signed, "Sad." Vera tried to smile, a little. "Why?" She hesitated, then signed slowly, "Because once I loved a baby I never got to hold." Stella watched her, serious and gentle, then signed, "Hold me." Vera's breath caught. She opened her arms and Stella climbed in. Marco, standing unseen at the edge of the library, didn't move for a long time. He began to understand that Vera didn't love Stella because the child made it easy. She loved her because something in Stella spoke to the part of her that had been grieving in silence for years. He and Vera drew closer without any grand gestures. It happened in the nights she stayed late because Stella had a nightmare. In the afternoon, he found her in the kitchen, teaching Stella to knead dough while Flour dusted both their sleeves. In the moment, she glanced at him across the room after Stella laughed and murmured, "This house sounds different now," then corrected herself with a small, sad smile. "Feels different." "It does," he answered. One night, after Stella had fallen asleep on the library sofa, Vera gathered the picture books into her bag, while Marco stood by the window, watching rain slide down the glass. Rain always made Stella restless. Though she couldn't hear it, she felt it in the light, in the pressure of the air, in the way the adults went quiet whenever a storm rolled in. "She remembers," Vera said softly. He looked at her. She was a newborn. The body remembers what the mind can't. He looked at Stella asleep beneath a blanket. "I found her in rain like this." Vera's hands went still. "I know." "No," he said. "You know that I found her. You don't know what it looked like." He rarely spoke about that night, but the words came easier with her. She was in the middle of the road, not hidden, not sheltered, left where someone would either stop or drive over her. No name, no note, nothing. Vera's face had drained of color, though he didn't understand why yet. "The doctors told me she was deaf," he went on. "That's when I understood why she'd been left. They didn't even wait to find out who she'd become." Vera looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "People can be cruel when a child doesn't match the life they pictured." He studied her. "Is that what happened to you?" She swallowed. "I don't know what happened anymore. I only know what I was told." He didn't push. Vera stayed late that night, and when Stella woke from a small nightmare, she reached not only for Marco but for Vera too. He sat on one side of the bed, Vera on the other. Stella's hands trembled as she signed rain. Marco signed safe. Vera signed home. Stella looked between them, then signed, "Papa safe, Vera home." Neither adult spoke after that. There was nothing simple about what they felt, but Stella had already named it before either of them could. A month later, Stella made her wish plain. She sat in Marco's office drawing 3 figures on a sheet of paper. One tall man in black, one small girl in blue, one woman in a gray dress with kind hands. She carried the drawing to his desk. "Nice," he signed. She shook her head and pointed at the woman. "Vera, stay," he signed. "For dinner?" She frowned, annoyed he hadn't understood, and signed again, slower. "Vera, stay forever." He looked at the drawing, then at his daughter. "Forever is a long time." She signed simply. "Good." That night, he asked Vera to walk with him in the garden after Stella was asleep. The guards kept their distance. The air was cool, the lamps along the stone path glowing soft. Vera wrapped her coat around herself, looking uneasy. "If this is about Stella asking me to stay forever, she already told me she asked you." He almost laughed. "Of course she did. She's very direct." "She gets that from me." Vera smiled, then looked away. "Marco, I love her. You know that. But staying forever isn't a small thing. I know. Your world isn't simple." "No, and you aren't simple." "No," he agreed. "But Stella is." Vera looked at him. He went on. "She loves whoever makes her feel safe. She trusts whoever sees her. She's chosen you the way children choose. Without strategy, without fear, without asking what she stands to gain." Her eyes softened. "And you?" He was quiet a moment. "I've spent years protecting my daughter from people who wanted to pity her, use her, fix her, silence her. Then you walked into a restaurant and asked if she wanted ice in her water." Vera gave a shaky little laugh, tears already gathering. "That wasn't very romantic." "It was to me." She looked down, overwhelmed. He stepped closer but didn't touch her. "I'm not asking you into my life because it's easy. It isn't. I'm asking because this house has been warmer since you walked into it. My daughter smiles differently because of you, and He stopped, not because he didn't know what he felt, but because he wasn't used to saying it aloud. "And you?" Vera finished softly. "I trust you with the only heart I have." Her tears fell then. He reached out slowly, giving her time to step back. She didn't. He brushed her cheek with the back of his fingers. "Marry me, Vera." She closed her eyes. "I'm afraid." "So am I." That made her open them again. Marco Contini, admitting fear, sounded impossible, yet there it was, plain and human. "I'm afraid of losing what you've brought into this house," he said. "I'm afraid of Stella being hurt again. I'm afraid you'll wake up one day and decide my world is too much. And if I stay," she whispered, "then you stay as family, not as a tutor, not as someone I pay, as mine, as hers, as yourself." She looked through the garden windows toward the room where Stella slept, then back at him. "I loved a daughter once and lost her." Her voice broke. "I don't know if my heart still knows how to survive loving another child." He answered gently. "Maybe Stella isn't asking you to survive it. Maybe she's asking you to live again," Vera cried quietly, and he held her without asking for anything more. Her answer arrived the next morning. Stella sat at breakfast, watching both adults with open suspicion. Vera knelt beside her chair and signed. "If you still want me to stay, I will." Stella stared, then her hands flew so fast Marco had to sign, "Slow down." She signed again, trembling with happiness, "Forever." Vera nodded, "Forever." Stella threw herself into her arms, then reached for Marco too, pulling him down until all 3 were caught in an awkward, laughing embrace beside the breakfast table. The wedding was small and private. No grand cathedral, no city full of guests. Just a modest ceremony in the garden, with Teresa dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, a handful of trusted men standing stiffly in suits, and Stella in a pale blue dress holding flowers she kept forgetting to toss because she was too busy watching Vera. When the vows ended, Stella walked between them, took both their hands, and signed family. Vera knelt in front of her, unable to hide her tears. Stella touched her cheek and signed, "Almost, Mama?" Vera's lips trembled. She signed back, "Only if your heart wants that." Stella didn't hesitate. "My heart knows." Marco looked away for a moment, but Teresa caught his eyes and smiled through her own tears. For a few weeks, contentment settled over the estate so gently that no one wanted to question it. Vera moved into the East Wing at first, then gradually into the rooms where Stella spent most of her time. Stella began leaving little drawings on Vera's pillow, Marco started coming home earlier without bothering to invent a business excuse. The house no longer felt like a fortress with a child locked inside it. It felt like a home being built one ordinary day at a time. Then Vera found the blue blanket. It happened on a rainy afternoon while Stella was at a therapy session with Teresa, and Marco was in his study on a call. Vera had been sorting Stella's closet, since the child had outgrown half her clothes but refused to let anyone move anything without a proper goodbye. On the top shelf, tucked behind a box of old baby shoes and folded nursery linens, she found a small wooden memory box. She hadn't meant to disturb anything private, but the lid was already loose, and when she shifted it, a corner of faded blue cloth slipped free. The color drained from her face before she even touched it. Some memories don't return slowly. They arrive whole. The hospital room, her weakened body, the smell of antiseptic, the small blanket she'd stitched during the last month of her pregnancy, because she couldn't afford anything finer but wanted her daughter to have something made by her own hands. Blue cloth, a tiny moon stitched in one corner. Vera reached into the box with shaking fingers and lifted the blanket out. It had been cleaned, carefully kept, but she recognized it instantly. Her knees nearly buckled. In the corner, faded but still visible, sat the small hand-stitched moon, and beneath it, hidden almost within the thread, 2 tiny letters, V.A. "No," she whispered. Marco found her there minutes later, standing in Stella's room with the blanket pressed to her chest, all color gone from her face. He ended his call the instant he saw her. "Vera?" She looked at him as though through water. "Where did you get this?" His eyes dropped to the blanket. Something in him went rigid. "It was with Stella the night I found her." She shook her head. "No." He stepped closer. "Vera." Her fingers tightened around the fabric. "I made this." The room went silent. He didn't move. She touched the stitched moon with a trembling finger. "I made this for my daughter before she was born. I stitched this moon because I used to call her my little moon whenever she moved at night." Ting quote. The air seemed to change around him. "Your daughter." She looked at him, tears rising too fast to stop. "They told me she died." For a moment, neither spoke. Rain filled the silence against the windows. He looked at the blanket, then toward the hallway where Stella's laughter drifted faintly up from downstairs where she was playing with Teresa. "Vera," he said carefully, "are you sure?" She almost laughed, but it broke into a sob. A mother knows the things she made for her child. Her knees gave, and he caught her before she fell. She pushed against his chest, not in anger at first, but in shock, in pain, in confusion. "You had her," she cried. "You had my baby all these years." He held her arms gently. "I didn't know she was yours. I buried her in my heart," she said, voice cracking. "I mourned her. I slept with empty arms. I thought I'd failed her, and she was here." His own face tightened with pain. "I found a baby in the rain. No name, no note, no bracelet. No one came looking. All I knew was that someone had left her to be found by strangers." Vera pressed the blanket to her mouth, trying to breathe. "Matteo told me she died." Marco's eyes sharpened. "Your husband, ex-husband." She wiped her tears with a shaking hand. "Matteo Rossi. His mother, Ornella, was there. His family doctor was there. I was so weak after the delivery. They gave me something. I kept asking for my baby, and they kept telling me she was gone." Her voice dropped lower. "I remember hearing them whisper before I passed out. Something about her not reacting, something about silence. I thought I'd dreamed it." His jaw tightened, though he kept his voice steady for her sake. "They knew she was deaf." Vera looked at the blanket. "And they took her from me." The whole truth didn't surface all at once. Marco made calls, but never in front of Stella. He sent men to trace records, nurses, old payments, the doctor who had signed the false death certificate, the driver who had worked for the Rossi family 5 years earlier and vanished shortly after. Within days, the story became clear enough to break anyone who heard it. Vera had given birth to a living daughter. The infant hadn't responded to sound. Matteo Rossi and his mother had panicked, not from grief, but from shame. They didn't want a deaf child tied to their family name. They paid off the doctor, told Vera her baby had died, filed a fraudulent certificate, then paid a driver to abandon the newborn on a road outside the city. Not hidden in the brush, not somewhere she'd certainly perish, but in the middle of a road where some stranger would be forced to stop, take her in, and never know whose child she was. They never imagined that stranger would be Marco Contini's convoy. They never imagined the man feared across half the city's business world would become the father of the very child they'd thrown away. When Marco told Vera everything he'd found, she didn't scream. She sat perfectly still, the blue blanket in her lap. Sometimes grief grows too large for sound. He left me because she was deaf, she said finally. Marco sat beside her. He left because he was weak. He told you your daughter died, then blamed you for the sorrow in his house. Her mouth trembled. He let me hate my own body for bringing a child into the world he'd already discarded. Marco took her hand. He'll answer for it. I don't want Stella surrounded by revenge. No, he said. She'll be surrounded by truth. Telling Stella was the hardest thing either of them had ever done. They waited for evening, once the house had quieted and the rain had stopped. Marco and Vera sat with her on the carpet in her room, the blue blanket folded nearby. Stella looked between the two adults and immediately sensed something serious was happening. Bad? She signed. Marco shook his head. Not bad. Important. Vera's hands trembled. He steadied them with his own for a moment before letting go. She signed slowly, carefully, tears already sliding down her cheeks. When you were a baby, I was your mama. Stella stared at her. Vera continued, each sign breaking her and mending her at once. I loved you before I ever knew your name, but people lied to me. They told me you were gone. I didn't know where you were. Stella looked confused, then turned to Marco. Vera, Mama? He nodded. Yes. Fear flooded her eyes so suddenly that Vera nearly broke completely. Stella signed. Papa leaving? He moved at once, kneeling in front of her, signing with both hands, clear and firm. Never. She looked from Vera to Marco. 2 homes? He shook his head. 1 home. More love. Vera sobbed quietly. Stella stared at them a long moment, trying to grasp something even adults barely managed to hold, then reached toward Vera and touched her cheek. Vera closed her eyes. Stella signed. Mama sad. Vera nodded. Stella touched Marco's hand, then Vera's, and pulled them together, placing her own small hands over theirs. Then, carefully and clearly, she signed, Papa, Mama, home. Vera broke completely, pulling Stella into her arms. Stella held her back, confused by the depth of her mother's tears, but not frightened by them. Marco wrapped both of them in his arms and lowered his head. For the first time since that night on the Poplar Road, he let himself believe that maybe Stella hadn't only been found by him, maybe she'd been leading all 3 of them back to one another. The Rossi family tried to deny everything. Matteo arrived at Marco's office 3 days later with lawyers, arrogance, and the same polished cruelty that had once convinced Vera she was the broken one. Ornella Rossi came with him, dressed in black pearls and cold perfume, looking far more offended than ashamed. This is an absurd accusation, Matteo said. Vera was unstable after the birth. She imagined things. Vera stood beside Marco, pale but steady. Stella wasn't in the room. Marco had refused to let her be used as a weapon in adult lies. He laid the blue blanket on the table, then the false death certificate, then the payment records, then a signed statement from the nurse who'd been paid to keep Vera sedated, and finally a recorded confession from the driver, older now, and terrified, admitting where he'd left the baby and who had paid him. Matteo's expression shifted with each piece of evidence. Ornella's lips pressed thin. You don't understand what families like ours face, she said coldly. A child like that would have ruined everything. Vera flinched but didn't look away. Marco's voice stayed low. A child like that? Ornella lifted her chin. A deaf girl. A mute child. The pity, the questions, the shame. We made a difficult choice. Marco looked at Matteo. And you let your wife grieve a living child. Matteo swallowed. I did what was necessary. Vera stepped forward before Marco could answer, her voice shaking but unbroken. No, you did what was easy. You threw away our daughter and called it necessary because you were too small to love someone who needed more from you. Matteo looked away first. That was all Marco needed to see. The legal process that followed was quiet but thorough. Marco didn't start a war. He didn't need one. He used documents, witnesses, lawyers, and the kind of pressure powerful families understood instinctively. The forged death certificate was exposed. The doctor lost his license and faced criminal charges. Matteo and Ornella lost their reputation, their charity positions, their standing in every circle they'd worked so hard to impress. Vera was legally recognized as Stella's biological mother. Marco remained Stella's legal father through adoption, and through every truth that actually mattered. When a reporter later asked him whether he'd ever felt burdened raising another man's child, he looked at the man so long he forgot his next question. "She was never another man's child," Marco said. "She was mine from the night I chose her." He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. 1 year later, a building that had once been an unused Contini property near the river reopened under a new name above its doors: Stella House. It wasn't a hospital, an orphanage, or a charity built for photo opportunities. It was a center for deaf children, for abandoned children, and for families who needed to learn that silence was not the same as emptiness. Vera helped design the classrooms. Marco funded the entire project without putting his name anywhere on the front. Stella chose the color of the playroom walls and insisted every child receive cake on their first day, because new places are frightening, but cake helps. On opening day, Stella stood between Marco and Vera in a pale yellow dress, her hair tied with a blue ribbon. She was 6 now, carrying herself with quiet confidence. She signed with the other children, corrected the adults when they got a gesture wrong, rolled her eyes at Marco whenever he grew too serious, and squeezed Vera's hand when she started crying during the welcome speech. Teresa watched from the front row, smiling the way someone smiles at a miracle that grew one ordinary day at a time. After the ceremony, Stella ran back to Marco and tugged his sleeve. He bent down immediately. She signed, "Proud." He signed back, "Very proud." She smiled, then signed, "I love you, Papa." He touched her cheek. Even after all this time, those words still undid him completely. Vera knelt beside them. Stella turned to her and signed, "I love you, Mama." Vera pressed a hand to her mouth, then signed back, "I love you more than every day I lost." Stella didn't understand the full weight of that sentence, but she understood the love in it. She took Marco's hand in one of hers and Vera's in the other, looked at them both, and signed, "My family." Marco met Vera's eyes over their daughter's head. He had once believed he'd simply found a child in the rain and saved her, but standing there, with Stella between them and Vera's hand in his, he understood the truth ran deeper than that. Stella had saved him from a life built only on fear. She had saved Vera from a grief with no grave to visit. She had turned a mansion into a home, a waitress into a mother again, and a dangerous man into a father who had learned to listen with his hands. The world had left her in the rain because it believed her silence made her worthless. But Stella Contini grew up surrounded by people who knew better. Her silence had never been empty. It had always been full of love.